I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's live webinar entitled Accelerating Lab Execution, Vitalizing BIOVIA OneLab with Growth in Mind, presented today by Astrix Technology. And we go to the next slide, please. So before we get into today's presentation, I want to take a moment and explain a little bit about who Astrix is, why we're talking to you today about these topics, before we turn it over to our speaker. So a quick company snapshot of who we are. We successfully deliver highly specialized services, process technology, as well as outsourced services to fundamentally transform how science-based businesses operate. We do this all in an effort to improve scientific outcomes and the lives of people everywhere. A few quick statistics about the company. We were established in 1995 and today are privately held. We originated as the IT division of APBI Life Science Research Organization, and we operate from 7 offices in the United States and beautiful Costa Rica. Our headquarters are in Red Bank, New Jersey. In terms of kind of who we serve, customers, we deal with Fortune 1000 life science enterprises. We deal with chemical companies, CPG, government research institutions, typically all with large and fast-growing IT outsourced or compliance needs. We are the market leader in dedicated digital transformation services and expert outsourced services for the scientific community. We can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the scope of solutions that we are capable of delivering to an organization, we span the complete life cycle of scientific data systems needs. And this begins with the first 2 boxes are business process analysis and enterprise architecture. These are really services that are designed to help an organization understand their technology needs from the ground up. This could be everything from what your technology stack needs to look like, what it should be built on, is this going to be a cloud-based solution, et cetera, et cetera. From there, we can help you select the right tools. We're vendor agnostic. We can come in and basically help you choose a technology stack, based on what we find in our first 2 boxes. From there, we can assist with the development and implementation. And then we can, once that's complete, come in and do computer systems validation to make sure everything is up to snuff with FDA guidance. From there, we can be an ongoing resource for organizations to help optimize the quality and delivery of these software solutions. We can assist with training, upgrades, et cetera. And then we can even provide staff, and that staff can be technical staff or that staff can be scientific staff. So again, we're really kind of spanning the entire life cycle. Well, that's enough about Astrix. We want to go ahead and get into the meat of today's presentation. So with that, we'll go ahead to the next slide and I'll introduce today's speaker. So Adam Riva is a delivery manager here at Astrix, and he's responsible for leading the BIOVIA OneLab practice within the professional services organization at Astrix. And he brings over 10 years of experience deploying life science solutions, most of which have been directly for BIOVIA, including their legacy and their next generation products. So it's with great pleasure I'll introduce Adam. I'll let him take it from here and I'll pop back on at the end to handle questions. Thank you very much.
Awesome, perfect. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Adam, did you go on mute?
Sorry about that. All right.
There we go.
Hi, everybody. Is that better? All right, so jumping into today. So first, we'll take a look at the agenda. So first, we're going to touch on master data and standardization with master data. We're really going to visit kind of what value does that provide and some techniques behind it. We're going to take a look at recipe reusability. Some of you on the call might be familiar with some legacy BIOVIA products and how you've configured it in your lab today, and we can take a look at how you may be able to do it differently within OneLab. We're going to take a look into activities and activity plans and maybe some best practices and how to leverage them. And lastly, we're going to take a look at collaborative spaces and see how having a plan in place of how to expose collaborative spaces may be able to help your team grow and become a global platform. All right. So first thing we're going to start with is reasons for master data standardization. So one thing that comes to mind is unified training. If everyone's using master data in the same way and we're standardizing on it in a way that we don't have as many entities within the system, training just becomes easier. It's something that can be reused across multiple sites or multiple groups. And if every team is functioning in the same way, that's just going to make it even easier to train up new users or existing. We're also going to reduce the migration records. So this is going to help with your migration and not having such specific entities to each of your workflows. Being able to make them more of a global reusable entities is going to reduce that footprint. Company alignment. It's so common that working on projects that you'll see that across a company, each group, each site really functions differently. And so the goal is to have the company function the same or close to the same. And standardizing on master data is one method that we can use to help build some of that alignment. And lastly, improved validation process. If you're able to validate something that could be reused for multiple tasks, that's just less entities and less components that a team would require validation across your system and solution. So moving on to some of the techniques themselves. So the first thing that's a pretty straightforward thing. It's just a matter of working through what works best for you and your team is your naming conventions. So obviously it's best if we're able to keep some of these names generic. This creates flexibility within your system. So across OneLab, if you're familiar with it, as we know, there are a large number of components that are all related to each other. If we use naming conventions for each one that are structured in a way that everyone that would understand, that's going to create a smaller footprint, and it's going to be able to make it easier for users to be able to know how to use the system. Using information within the name can help improve some of this usability. Things like parameter templates. It's pretty common that you're not just necessarily going to use the out-of-the-box parameter templates that exist with the system. And so with this, when you create something that's a little more custom, it's nice if you actually include things like the type within the name. So in this example, I'm calling out specifically, if I wanted to create a parameter template that was a list type of yes or no, I could simply just name this list dash yes or no. And what this is going to do is the recipe author, when they're going to add parameters into their recipe, they'll be able to easily filter through and sort through this list and be able to find exactly what they're looking for. One thing to keep in mind with name conventions, especially with master data in OneLab, is it's pretty common that a lot of the components you may see as a recipe author, but if you're an end user that's executing within capture or task plan, you may not even see some of these custom names that you have in the background. So having them generic and not specific to that particular test is only going to add value with your authoring and solution as a whole. Moving into the next thing is the migration strategy. So it's really, really, really common that I'll start working on a customer project and they've already have multiple environments in place. They've already moved some of their data across these environments. And unfortunately, that data is not aligned. OneLab is very, very important to have your master data, have the names and the GUIDs, which is your IDs in the background, be aligned across environments. And what this is going to do is it's going to improve your rollouts for any deliveries that you may have, any support that you may require, and it's going to reduce the amount of time for any of these manual updates that you may have to do. This is something that the sooner you get in place and a strategy to it, the better. Now, everyone has a different layout with their environments, and you may have more than one development environment, or maybe you only have 3 environments and not 4 like displayed below. But this is something that we're able to work with the team and really work through of what's going to work best for you to keep all of your environments in line. I've spent countless amount of hours trying to align environments that were previously configured and were done improperly to the point that it's just creating so much overhead and extra time to be able to really perform any of your day-to-day functions. Now, obviously with OneLab, we have a tool called Configuration Manager. Now with that, it's really important to use a tool such as that in order to do these migrations. Trying to do these migrations manually, you're going to be leaving components behind that now will no longer be aligned. And since there are so many components and so many relationships between the components, this will only cause issues and break things moving forward. And lastly, like I said, it's best to start this as early as possible. The earlier that we can take a look at your architecture and get a plan in place, the better off you're going to be moving forward. And the next technique is defining structure. So understanding the relationship between all the master data within OneLab is difficult because there's so many different components that exist within the system, but it's important to get aligned as soon as possible. One of the ones that is pretty obvious and clear is equipment. So whenever a customer jumps into a OneLab system, they're all excited. They want to load in all their equipment without necessarily taking a minute to say, okay, how am I going to be using this equipment? How am I going to be calling it out within my recipes and from my task plan? How will the user be expecting to be able to execute and select and have control against it? Now you can see in my example down below, I may be trying to just simply record pipettes into the system. And commonly people will use, oh, we're just gonna call out equipment class of pipette. We're gonna give it a type, which is just the manufacturer, maybe the size. So in this case, a 50 microliter in the model. And then you're gonna have your instance against it. Now, once that's in place, if I'm a recipe author and I'm trying to take a look at it and say, okay, how do I filter down to only allow a user to enter in pipettes that are 50 microliters? You can't really control that with that, because in the recipe, it's controlled based off of the class and the type. And if I'm calling out in the type specifically the manufacturer model, I imagine that you may have multiple manufacturer models of the pipette. And so that control no longer exists with the structure that you have in place. Now, another way of doing it, which is still giving you the same information, is on my equipment class, I might call it out as being a 50 microliter pipette. And now in my recipe, I could simply just narrow down to that class itself and be able to call on any of the types that might be registered against it. Now, each example is not wrong. It's really going to be working through what is your process today, how do you expect to be able to call and use the equipment, and by that, we'll actually make a good determination of what's the best structure moving forward. This is just looking at equipment, but this structure and these relationships exist all over OneLab. And so it's something that you want to be really careful of when you're starting off with OneLab and building it out. All right, so now we're going to look into approaches for extended recipe reusability. So one of the biggest things I see is legacy BIOVIA LES customers, or SmartLab, as some of you may know it, are so used to, I have a paper method, I go into method builder and procedure manager, I make my method, and then that method gets run. And that's simply a one-to-one relationship. With OneLab, there's actually an additional layer that actually really provides a lot of value that not a lot of customers take advantage of. And so with that, take a look. So BIOVIA LES, we have our procedure and our procedure sessions that may be branching off of this. Now in OneLab, like I said, we have additional layers, and these layers are controlled with activities and task plans. Now my recipe relates back to my procedure, and my procedure session relates back to my capture session, but adding this activity level is now going to enable you to be able to have more control of that recipe and not have it be so static and defined for what you're trying to accomplish. So if I take a look at this, I could have a recipe which is going to be related just to a parent activity. And from there, we could create as many child activities that we want. And now these child activities can then go off and be added to a task plan or a capture session to accomplish what you're looking for. So this is kind of an example. It's kind of the easy example to always jump to. I may simply make a generic recipe that's just a 2-component solution. I may have multiple child activities against this that's really going through and defining what are each of those components, how do I want the user to run it. Then you're going to have your task plans that may be set off to be a certain particular test. Maybe it's a dissolution, maybe it's content uniformity. And those capture sessions within those task plans are going to be related to the child activities that you made off of that recipe and not directly related to the recipe itself. Giving that additional layer of the child activity, what it does is enables you to control things like your material names, your plan values, your units, your formatting. And what that means is in my recipe, instead of calling out specifically, I want acetonitrile to be recorded within my recipe, I may just say that this is, component number 1. And in my child activity, I can actually specify what that component is. Now, plan values adds a lot of control as well. That can establish things such as limits throughout my execution. It can also help me control activation branches. So I may build out activation branches within my recipe that I want to be able to control based off of a setting that's on the child activity itself and not on the recipe. And that can be accomplished by using this approach. Units can be modified as well on each of these input parameters, as well as formatting. So when I say formatting, it's referring to your rounding, your number of decimals, that sort of thing. Now, with this, what it's going to enable you to do is you're going to be able to just validate your recipe itself. You're going to prove that the recipe works. And now anytime you want to expand this recipe out to be able to do different functions that are built into it, it's simply just the creation of a child activity, which is just simple system configuration. It does, and I encourage to have a review process to it, but it's not you going through a full validation because you've already proven that the recipe functions in the way that you're expecting it to. And since that is already complete, it's going to save you a lot of time to be able to expand out these generic recipes, to be able to use them in many different ways. Now, as I mentioned before, we're able to control activation branches with these inputs. We're also able to set the parameters within your recipe to be actually labeled as hidden. And what this is going to do is a user executing in Capture, they may not even know that this recipe is built out to do 10 different functions. They may only know the function that that child activity was configured to for their particular execution. The system's automatically going to be skipping steps or activation branches that aren't set to be activated. They're not going to see parameters that are just displayed simply for a value that we're using to help drive the recipe. We only want them to be able to see and take a look at parameters that are important to their particular execution. So doing this, what is it going to do? So reducing the number of recipes, it's going to increase your scalability. You're going to be able to have a recipe that's so generic that you can build it out to be able to accomplish multiple different things. You may build out one recipe that handles the content uniformity, but you may have 20 products that perform a content uniformity, some a little different than others, but we'd like to build it out in a way that those differences can be controlled within the child activity itself. Again, so you're not creating a different recipe for every single test that you're building for every single product. So that's really going to reduce the size of your footprint. So this is going to increase your deployment times. Like I said, if you go to a new site and they're going to start to take a look at one of these recipes that you've authored, they'll be able to simply just create new child activities that work for them. And they'll be able to just leverage that. They're not going to have to go through the whole process of authoring brand new recipes. There's going to be larger acceptance since there's so much flexibility built into your recipes and your child activities. Naturally, it's just going to be accepted more widely. The reduced validation, which we touched on a little bit before, your simplified training, which we touched on as well. If everyone's using the system in the same way, it just makes it that much easier. If I just have to train the users on one generic recipe on how to configure a child activity, and they'll then understand and know how to execute it and create more moving forward, that's just going to increase your growth, increase your ability to expand. And obviously with all of this, it's going to improve your ROI. All right, so activities and activity plans. So with this, I may be building out so many generic recipes and have each of these individual sections of these recipes built out into smaller chunks that are all going to exist inside of the same task plan. Now with it, what's a good way of organizing it? So that's with using activity plans. So activity plans I always kind of refer to as like the binder of your execution. It's where you're going to keep track of your samples, your activities that you're executing, as well as the results that come out of these activities. Now, since we are creating these recipes to be reused, like I said, we're going to have them be in separate, smaller chunks just so they can be reused across. Now, with it, I may have an activity plan that's sent out for my content uniformity. This may include a standard prep, a sample prep, maybe something mobile phase, and then as well as my content uniformity test itself. Now, the execution is all going to be in one place. It's all going to be driven by these child activities, but they simply just have to add an activity plan to their task plan. And now everything that is expected to be executed will all be in one place. Now, if it's an execution that's simply working off of one activity and it doesn't have multiple associated to it, I don't encourage using activity plans. That's just going to add another layer that doesn't really add any additional value. The value with activity plans only comes into play when you have multiple tasks that will always be executed together. And with that, it gives you even additional value beyond just simply being able to just add one component to your task plan that goes in and adds all these tasks. It also allows you to define predecessors. Now, today in the system, this is very static. You could only have it one predecessor per each, and you can set it in one order. But with it, if there's something in particular that needs to be executed prior to one of the other tasks, this is something that you are able to configure and are able to set up. Now, collaborative spaces. So what collaborative spaces enable you to do is it's going to allow you to take your OneLab instance and be able to expand it out to multiple sites and multiple groups without those groups seeing each other's data. And when I say seeing each other's data, it's not all data within the system. If there's particular executions that one group should see that another group shouldn't, This is easy to configure within the system to be able to have set up. It's only going to be about restricting the visibility. There's natural control within OneLab if you have your permissions set up correctly, that I may have a personal task plan that even if everyone's in the same collaborative space, they're not going to be able to get into my task plan and perform anything or make any changes. But this is expanding even beyond that. This is being able to set it up so that I have my own little silos for each of my groups or each of my sites, and they're able to work in their own area without seeing each other's and crowding up their data. Now, why is this important? This is important with this growth. So if we're getting to a point where we have activities that are being used by multiple sites and multiple groups, we want to be able to configure them so that everyone's able to access these activities. They may have a particular child activity that's associated to their site that another site may not use. And it's really trying to narrow down your actual executions itself. It's not trying to take away from your admin functions. Like I said on the previous slide there, I had things listed out such as like your users, your groups, your parameter templates. Those are going to be shared across all collaborative spaces. But with activities are specific to a collaborative space, but there are ways of sharing this information out so that other groups can access it. And kind of the way that this is something that I could work with, or we could work with your team on really establishing what's the best approach and what's going to work best for you. But the common way that I'll see it is you'll have one collaborative space that's really configured and set up for all your authoring. That's where your SMEs are going to have access to go in. They're going to author recipes. These recipes are going to be activity driven, and they're going to be automatically associated to a parent activity. And once they're set up as an activity, they actually have the ability to be shared out. But when they're shared out as read only. So what that's going to give you is that if I'm on one collaborative space and I author a recipe in a parent activity, and I go to my second collaborative space, I'll be able to see that parent activity. I won't be allowed to make any changes to it, but I am allowed to create child activities against it. And this logic and these restrictions exist on parent activities or child activities. It's really just activities as a whole. So if I'm one site that I created a recipe and I created my parent activity and it's all approved, I create my child activity and other sites are going to use it, I have the capability of marking this child activity as shared out to the other collaborative spaces. And that way other groups will be able to use it. There are use cases that you may be doing something specific to your site that really won't be used in other places. And so you may work off of this parent activity and create a child activity in your own site, and no one else has access. And that's no problem at all. Again, this is really going to be just a way to structure it to work for you and your team and how it would best work for you. And so that's the end of my slides here. So Kevin, do we want to jump into any questions that may be out there?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thank you for a great presentation. Really appreciate that, Adam. So let me do a couple things here. First and foremost, I want to go ahead and get the recording stopped. We typically